Hey, friends of the planet, Miro here. And today we're really excited to have a friend of the planet with us, Mo Elleithee, who's the executive director of Georgetown University's School of Politics and Public Service at the McCourt School of Public Policy. So, Mo, thank you so much for taking the time on this snowy day. I know as I look out the window, it's kind of rain snowing right now and the whole country is in disarray. So thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today.
Any chance to stay inside on a day like this, I'll take, but I'm so excited to be with you guys.
Yeah, absolutely. And Friends of the Planet, if you recall, the climate forum that we put on with Georgetown and MSNBC was very much the brainchild of us and Mo. So we have worked together on great climate causes before, and we're just really excited for this conversation. But Mo, I wanted to ask about a recent poll that the center put out that found 87% of people polled blamed special interests for the lack of civility in politics. And I wanted to ask, what were the main takeaways from this poll? And if you could dive down a little bit more on this data that you found.
So for about 2 years now, we have been doing regular polling on the issue of civility in politics. We partnered with two legendary pollsters, Ed Goaz, who's a Republican pollster, and Celinda Lake, who's a Democratic pollster. And we've been tracking Americans' attitudes towards civility. How bad do they think it is? Who do they blame? And do they really want it? And what we found in our most recent poll, we were in the field in early January. And in fact, we were in the field for 4 nights. The insurrection happened on the 3rd day. So,
Wow.
I mean, talk about a time to be polling people's attitudes on civility. We found a couple of really interesting things. Number one, people believe that it is as bad as it has ever been, at least since we've been tracking it.
It feels like it.
Right? When you ask people on a scale of 0 to 100, how bad are the political divisions in our country? 0 being no political division and 100 being edge of civil war, the mean response is 79.
Wow.
That's pretty bad. And it's the highest we've ever seen it. But what surprised me was that people are optimistic. Despite that, when we ask them the same question, but to project a year from now, how bad do you think it will be 1 year from now? We found that the mean response was 65, still pretty high, but moving in the right direction. When we ask them whether or not President Biden will be able to deliver on his call for unity, clear majority of people believe he will be at least somewhat successful in that. When we ask them whether or not the president and the Congress will be able to work together to get results, 90% of people say they want that to happen. And about 65 or so percent say they think that they will be at least somewhat successful. So there are signs that people are cautiously optimistic. But to the premise of your question about the special interests, when we ask people who's to blame, traditionally, President Trump was sort of in one of the top 2 slots since we started polling this. He's down to 3rd behind in the number 2 slot, special interests, and the number 1 slot with almost universal blame across the ideological spectrum is social media. So people kind of identify where the problems are, but are optimistic that things can get better.
So Mo, picking up on that, we look at the way these issues are playing out, particularly with respect to climate change and clean energy. And we're really, I think, anxious about the fact that some political forces in the country have been so able to demonize these things, to turn green programs into sort of the villain. We see that today as Texas is struggling under the burden of not having prepared for the severe weather that they're facing. And the first thing that happened was some politicians blamed the Green New Deal. How do you think we get past things like that? I mean, do you think that that's just inevitable, or can civility help us get over some of these kind of divisive terms and things that seem to be popular and would be good, more renewable energy?
I think this is one of our biggest challenges. I talked a moment ago about how there are signs of optimism, but there's still a lot of red flags. And one of them is that we are still very, very polarized. So while a clear majority of the country believes that the president will be at least somewhat successful in establishing unity, very few Republicans polled believe that. We still have a lot of polarization. And it's interesting because, when you look at an issue like climate and what's holding people back, going back to that point in the poll about people blaming special interests, I'm curious as we do more research on this to see how people define that, because I would suspect even that is polarized. I think a lot of people on the left, when they talk about special interests in the context of climate, would think of fossil fuel companies, right? Big oil, big gas. But if you ask people on the right who they would consider special interests, they would probably talk about radical environmental groups, both blaming those special interests, but having different definitions of who the special interests are. And I think that's going to be a challenge as we are seeing playing out in Texas right now. Everyone's sort of got their team jersey, and every team has an opponent, has a boogeyman. And until we can sort of bridge that gap a little bit, you would hope that the thing that could bridge that divide are facts. But as we're sort of living in an era right now where we can't even agree on baseline facts, and how we get past that is going to be a big challenge.
Mo, I'm going to jump in and ask about a particular ad I saw today on TV that exactly hit that point, that Gina McCarthy was accused of being a dark money funneler in the last election. And the group that they cited was NRDC, the Natural Resources Defense Council. So you see that happening right now. And it's interesting because this ad was on the more liberal MSNBC. And clearly the other side is trying to sow division within the kind of the more left-leaning part of the public.
No, I think that's right. And the polarized media ecosystem that we live in adds to this. The fact that, as you know, my side gig besides running the Institute at Georgetown is as a Democratic contributor on Fox News. When I'm over there, I feel like I'm living in a very different information ecosystem than when I'm watching MSNBC or when I'm watching CNN or another outlet. It's easy to demonize the other side when people are already going to media outlets that reinforce what they already think. As this information ecosystem becomes more sophisticated, so are the tactics being used by our political actors, right? To your point, going to MSNBC to try to drive a wedge between folks on the left, and frankly, folks on the left have done that in the past, running ads to try to drive wedges on the right. That's not helping the situation, right? It's not helping us sort of establish baseline facts, and it may be very politically powerful as a tool, but it's just further exacerbating this polarization.
I wanted to talk a little bit more about this polarization as it pertains to how lawmakers talk about it on Capitol Hill. And, for us in the environmental community specifically, I'm thinking about how the push to build out clean tech, renewables, EV infrastructure is being categorized by several Republican senators and on the House side as an attack on oil and gas, especially for, those representatives and members that come from oil and gas states. And we've seen this with Congresswoman Deb Haaland's soon-to-be nomination for her to become Interior Secretary, where she's being attacked as a radical for opposing drilling on public lands. Do you think there's a way to bridge this divide? Because ultimately, to solve climate change, we're going to need more renewable energy and low carbon technology. But again, this is a way of life for many Americans. So what's kind of the middle ground? How do we achieve what we need to achieve?
Yeah, I think in that last point you made is the key, right? That this is a way of life for many people. This is existential for many people. And I think the key is for policymakers to stop talking to each other to some extent and stop talking to the press and actually talking to the real people who are affected. It's an exercise I use with students at Georgetown all the time. I'll get really smart kids whose brains are far better wired for policy than mine will come in exasperated saying, I don't understand it. Some of the solutions on climate are so clear. Why can't we get anything done? And I'll say, okay, great. You're for renewable. You think we should emphasize that. Go to Kentucky, go to Mitch McConnell's constituents and talk to them about it. Listen to why they feel so threatened culturally, economically by this. You've got an answer for them, but go talk with them about it. And I think we need more of that. We need to stop talking about this purely as a policy issue and understand that it is a way of life, it is cultural, it is existential for Americans, and have the conversation at that level, because people's anxieties are legit. They're real. When you're a third generation, fourth generation in a community, in an industry, this is the kind of thing that can just rock your world. And so being able to explain to them how they can move forward, not they shouldn't worry, but why this isn't the threat to their existence, but more of an evolution, I think is key. How this plays out on the Hill is really interesting, though. And I think about something else that was in our poll, and it connects this to the polarization conversation. We ask people, how much do you really want civility in politics? You ask people the question like that, like 90% say yes. they want it. But ask the question a little bit differently. Agree or disagree? Common ground and compromise are noble goals we want our leaders to live up to. 88% of Americans say they want that. Very next question. Agree or disagree? I am tired of leaders compromising on my values. I want them to stand up and fight the other side. 87% say they agree with that. So it's as if people are saying, no, I totally want common ground. Just come stand where I am, and then we'll be on common ground. And that's being driven very much by the bases of both parties. If you're a political leader, that is a very fine line to walk. That's a very tight rope to walk. Because what's the incentive structure, right? Mitch McConnell's constituents may be saying, I want you to go to Washington and find compromise and common ground, just not on my issue. And if it's this, right, if it's what we're talking about here, how do you negotiate through that? And I think until people are sending more of a signal and more clarity on which side of that equation they're going to reward politically, political leaders are going to have a hard time deciding which way to go.
Yeah, I think you see even President Biden trying to walk on that tightrope a little bit because he's being attacked for not being uniting in his policies, and yet the policies themselves seem to be pretty popular. Do you think that's how he's going to get through it? Is just sort of sticking to the true north of what the public is looking for and trying to avoid the political crosswinds?
I think so. I mean, look, there's no greater special interest in politics than voters. Political leaders, Democrat or Republican, they're very free market on this. They react to the will of the market, and the market here, the marketplace of voters. And I think the Biden administration is being very smart in sort of redefining the conversation around bipartisanship, making it less about partisan players in Washington and more about the public, and showing on a daily basis that there is bipartisan support for his agenda. Right now, we're focusing on COVID relief, right? There is bipartisan support to go big on COVID relief, and using that to put pressure on members of Congress to, again, react to the will of their voters. I think that is a much smarter play than doing it the way we typically do it. That doesn't mean that he shouldn't try to negotiate. That doesn't mean he shouldn't try to find common ground. There won't be concessions in Washington. As much as we decry polarization, I always have to remind people politics is still a game of winners and losers.
Right.
And sometimes, in elections, there are winners and losers. Sometimes in legislation, there's winners and losers. So the political game, I think he's redefining a little bit in a way that should go through on a straight party line vote. He can still make the case for bipartisanship.
I think it'll be really interesting to see how he handles this with infrastructure, which could be the next big challenge, the next big thing. And the public seems to want it. And surely after this disaster in Texas, people see the need for it. It'll be interesting to see if he can walk that line again, where he takes on something big, tries to push through something big, and uses sort of public support in general to help push the other side to compromise a little bit with him when push comes to shove.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, infrastructure used to be the most bipartisan of issues on the Hill. Now there's not a lot of bipartisan issues, but hopefully he can, again, show the bipartisan support among the people. Now we'll see. I was on TV the other day. I was on Fox talking about COVID relief, and I was paired with a Republican strategist, someone who I know, who's very thoughtful, who's very smart, and who I have a lot of respect for. And we were talking about this issue of the bipartisan support that exists around COVID relief around the country. I said, that's more important than what happens on the Hill. And his response was, yeah, but Congress is the only one that matters. I think that's a dangerous place for the other side to be coming from, to say that, yes, they're the ones who vote, but to say that they're the only ones who matter in this conversation, more so than the will of the people who are the most affected by it. Right? I think that is the key, whether we're talking about COVID, whether we're talking about infrastructure, whether we're talking about climate or any other issue.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, that is one of the things that a lot of the environmental community is thinking through now that President Biden is in office, is how do you build the coalition now that you've won? That's the really key part. So Mo, thank you so much for your time and all of your insights. This was really a wonderful conversation, and I think gives us a lot to think about as we, move forward with COVID, with disaster recovery, and with climate action. So thanks again.
Well, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me. I love Our Daily Planet. It hits my inbox every morning. So keep doing what you're doing. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much. We're looking forward to our next thing that we can do together. Maybe we'll have to do a climate forum a year after they get some of this stuff passed and see how it's going.
We're ready to go.
Awesome.